Sorry. Yeah, I'll hand out, behind the roll sheet is a handout for tonight. And I'm going to ask y'all to share. Elaine already has her handout.
Oh.
She got the sneak preview version.
I didn't know for sure if I could be here, so I wanted to make sure I got to see it.
So just a reminder of what we're doing here. We're looking at this book, Resident Aliens, and thinking about the concept of being citizens of heaven, but residents of earth. And specifically the idea that we're enmeshed in this culture that's increasingly hostile toward Christians in the church. And how do we go about living in that environment? How do we engage with society? Last week, we took a quick trip through the Sermon on the Mount, looking at it as guidance for how we are to be peculiar. You might remember a couple of weeks ago when we started with Keep Austin Weird marketing campaign, and we talked about how it might actually be appropriate for us to think about a marketing slogan for the church: keep the church weird, because when it's not distinguishable from the world, there's a really good chance it's not the church anymore. And so we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, thinking about how it's kind of guidance for how we are to be peculiar. Maybe you remember what one of the things that always stands out to me about the Sermon on the Mount in this regard is that fairly long section there where Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say." Right? And he goes further and speaks to a different kind of obedience, not the measured checklist kind of obedience, but the obedience from the heart that doesn't just take the letter of the law, but moves on into the spirit of the law. And so even in the context of talking about the old law to people who were under the old law, he said, you ought to be weirder than that. would be one way to paraphrase that into some of the language that we've been using. And so that's where we ended up last time. And you might also then remember way back when we began, we talked about the idea of the church as a colony. And we had a lot of different definitions of colony that I drew from different places. But if you recall that original discussion about the church as a colony, what makes it a colony? Another way to think about that is when you look at these definitions of colony, where do you see alignment with your idea, your concept of the church?
Colony always means more than one.
Okay, so more than one person. So there's a single colony, the church, in a big universal sense. But nobody goes out to colonize North America with one person. I mean, most of the time when I think of colony, I think about the 13 colonies that are part of our heritage. Or I might think about the British colonies spread all over the world.
In science, a colony, it would be a colony that's not divided.
Okay, so think about
as
ants.
grow.
Okay, so it's growing.
Cells divide, they grow, they spread, and it grows. It's
Okay.
like yeast.
So a colony in that sense is sort of invasive.
Yes.
Okay, what else?
There's a specific purpose that colony believes in our definition of it, I suppose.
So there's a reason it exists.
Yes.
Somebody had some purpose. In the case of the 13 colonies, that's at the beginning of our nation, there were several reasons why different ones of those colonies existed. Some of them were specifically to flee religious persecution. Some of them were more trade oriented, where we've got this whole new world of resources that we can monetize. Various different reasons, but there was a purpose behind taking this group from here and putting it there to do something. What else?
Well, just like the 13 colonies, one of the reasons they came, for some of this really church, but one of the reasons that came over was taxation, unfair taxation. And so sometimes people leave churches for unfair reasons, or or they don't like this or that, or they feel like they're oppressed, and they may or may not be, but that's what they're feeling.
So they want to move from one colony to another, in a
Sometimes.
sense, to use our language.
Yeah.
When I look at all these different definitions, the one that really stands out to me is this number 6 that's bolded up here. A group of individuals or things, Elaine talked about the critters that often we think of as colonies, ants, and so forth. Individuals or things with common characteristics or interests, living in close association. And those are the two things that I really want to think about today. This is from my summary that's on the front of the page that you have there. Just a portion of what I've summarized, but it says, we are bound together by our belief that God is sovereign, a position with which those outside the church do not agree. This difference in perspective makes the church a colony. It marks us as distinctively different from the world. So if we think back then about that definition of people who have common characteristics or interests, what are the common characteristics or interests that we have?
Bible.
Okay, so we believe that we believe in the God of the Bible. We believe that God is sovereign, has power over everything around us, created everything. How we worship. So we think about when we come together, we have common ideas about what it means to come before God and offer him our worship.
What says if you love me, or Jesus said, if you love me, obey my commands. So we obey his command.
Okay, so we obey Jesus. We hold the person of Jesus and his example, and especially the words that we have captured in our Bible, to be words from God, words to live by.
Well, according to your definition here, number one, we believe in God, and many people in the world do not. Okay. We also believe that, that Jesus was God's son and came down here. Many people don't believe that. And so we also believe in that Jesus died, that he was buried, and that he rose. That's why we do communion each week, okay? And that's part of our worship. And so most of the world, may do bits and pieces of that, but not like we do.
And so because we believe in this God, and we believe in that he sent his son and that his son did all these things, we obey his commands. And when we do that, we look weird to people who, like you said, don't believe in that God, who don't believe in that son. Some of the things that we do and say and believe look really odd to other folks.
We also believe in Jesus only.
Okay. Yeah, so none of this pluralism like we talked about several weeks ago It's not all roads lead to God. You know, I just have a God with a different name. We said, no, there's one. And he showed us the one way. So one of the things that is common for us is that we are distinctively different from the world, according to what I've written up there. So let's think about this. What are some of the purposes of the church for believers and those who are actively seeking? Now, I'm not talking about people who are just out in the world. I'm talking about people who have not yet become Christians, but they're investigating and they're trying to learn. So what's the purpose of the church for believers and seekers? And especially, what are some purposes of Christian fellowship?
First thing that comes to my mind is just encouragement
Okay, so there's an encouragement aspect of it.
to be different from the world, to, when it's hard, keep being different from the world, to just keep on.
Okay, so oftentimes in our lives, our jobs, wherever our life takes us, trying to be the one who's different kind of wears you down a little bit. When you're separated from the church for very long at a time, it can make you kind of begin to question, why am I doing this? Why? But when we come together, we see other like-minded people who are engaging with the world and experiencing some of the same things that we are. And so there's a supportive aspect.
There's a mentor aspect to it.
Okay.
You don't just, encourage them, have a good week and go on. You gotta get involved with it.
And so the encouragement that you're talking about is more than just saying howdy and maybe shaking some hands. It's more engagement in the life of the other people, which kind of heads back to that definition, right? Common characteristics of people living in what? In close association with each other. I think we could probably come up with other distinct words that would also describe some purposes of Christian fellowship, but the two ideas that have been expressed here really are at the core of it, I think. One aspect of our fellowship is to support each other. If you look on the back page of the handout, you'll see a section, a little table there. Those are a bunch of verses that we could call one another passages. Look at all the things that we're supposed to do together. I'm not going to take the time to read all of those. One of the reasons I put it on the handout is maybe you can spend some time this next week kind of looking through some of those things and digging into this idea of one another. But the fact that it's there so many times is sufficient to suggest, maybe even to flat out teach, one of the reasons that we have Christian fellowship is to support one another, to bear with one another, to forgive one, and so on and so forth. It's togetherness, and it's supportive.
No,
Go ahead.
then he taught us that when we studied the one another passages, the one that seems that I think we get the most criticism of is forgiveness.
Mhm.
Forgive one another. Why do you want to do that? Person did something, a person lied to you. Well, yes, but I still need to forgive them. Why? People just don't understand why we can forgive someone who wronged us.
Mhm.
They think that's so, as in staying with your,
Mhm.
they think that's weird.
It's weird. Yeah, that's not, out in the world, I've followed athletics all my life. I love games, I love sports. And that's one place where you see it all the time, right? If you show somebody else up, they're going to show you up back. You know, one person starts jawing at somebody, another person's going to start yapping back at them. You know, you don't take nothing from nobody. It's kind of the mentality. And it's amplified in a competitive setting like sports, but it's also pretty common in everyday life.
Yeah.
But we forgive because we know what it's like to have experienced true forgiveness, big time forgiveness, forgiveness that saves us. And so it's easier, should be, I mean, it's not always, I mean, life is still a challenge, but with the right perspective, it's pretty easy to forgive that person who cut me off in traffic. It's pretty easy to forgive that person who had a cross word for me at work, because I know what it means to have been forgiven. It's easier for me to do so. And this kind of thing is actually what we have to offer the world that they can't get other places. You know, to your point, so many other people out in the world think it's weird that we do these things for one another, that we actually do care about people who at least began as strangers to us. But this is what we have to offer the world, as well as each other. True caring that's based on the love of God who saves us. We could look at other things and actually have already in this class in the past, thinking about the concepts, you know, we're a body. What does the body do? Well, the body takes care of itself. Well, I got a cut on one arm. I got a hand that knows how to get some medicine and take care of it. And if you want to expand that beyond, you know, just me, you think about, I cut myself, Elaine stitches me up. You know, when I'm at home, I've got another person who's part of our body as a family, but the family metaphor spills over to the church as well. So we're a body. We could take a look at Colossians, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, several places where that analogy or that metaphor is used. Other things that we offer each other aren't always easy and such a direct encouragement, but they're still necessary. How about accountability and correction? Now we're kind of headed into some of the mentorship that Steve talked about. Being who we're supposed to be and having fellowship with each other means we're also going to have some difficult conversations.
And we may not always agree.
Okay. I disagree with you.
Hey, get in line.
But kind of heading beyond just the supportive aspect, you know, we talked a little bit about the mentoring, and that's headed in to the other side of or one of the other main categories of purposes of Christian fellowship, which I think is to teach. We teach each other, and we are equipping ourselves to teach others.
The idea of mentorship is you grow, you know, right now you're teaching and you're growing more than you are because you're studying. That's true of any teacher. And so you mentor someone that they can become a mentor, and then they can become a mentor. It's an ongoing process.
It's interesting that you bring that up for several reasons. One, I've personally experienced that through teaching classes, but the first time that I really had that light bulb moment was when I went to be a camp counselor at White River Youth Camp. And I was really kind of frightened. I'm going to have 10 people or so directly in my charge, first of all, and I'm 19 years old. And And they're going to be looking at me. And I don't think I have this whole thing figured out yet. How in the world can I possibly do this? And one of the things that, silly me, but was a surprise to me was putting myself in that situation made me figure some things out a little bit better. And I got more out of that experience, I believe, than any of those kids did. And so I've experienced that. The other interesting thing about it is that's one of the examples that was used in the book. And it was specifically about mentoring in the context of what's the word that is used in some denominations, confirmation. They had like this year-long confirmation class. And so kids who are reaching that kind of age and maturity level, they wanted to find mentors for them for that year-long process that they had planned out for teaching these kids. Well, it turns out that one of the mentors, at least, was still really immature himself and ended up being called out and held accountable by the kid he was in charge of mentoring. And so the whole mentor-mentee relationship, you know, it just highlighted how it's not a one-way flow of somebody older giving their advice and sharing their wisdom with somebody else. It's a two-way street. When you become a mentor, you have the opportunity to mess up and be told about it, right?
Nothing better than kids to do that for you.
And they will expose
love
you.
exposing.
Most definitely. And so we teach. How does participating in the life of the body in a congregation teach and support Christian living? If we are in close association with one another, how are we taught and supported?
It's like the Holy Spirit helps them.
Okay.
Reading the word with each other. We often don't do it on our own.
So one of the, and I might be thinking way too basic for, you might be reading complexity into the question that I didn't intend to be there. One of the first requirements is that we're together. And so we can go to our favorite verse in the whole New Testament, in Hebrews 10. Right? Don't forsake the assembly. Okay? But there's a reason he says that. There's a reason the writer says that.
Well, in your question, there's a word that says participating. Okay. I don't know much about English, okay, but that's an action verb. Okay, so that means what? If you're participating in the life of the congregation, then that means that you're doing things, okay, not just occupying a space, okay, because that's not participating.
It's not just your shadow falling across the entryway. It's not just filling some space in a pew. You're looking around for what needs doing. You're looking around for people who need something.
That's participating.
That's participating.
That's action.
And those are just a few of the ways, but yeah, participating. One of the other things I had in mind here is that when we are together, aren't we taught by the example of other faithful Christians? My guess is that every one of us has a handful of people in their lives who they have known, who were very influential in shaping them and molding them. Hopefully, many of us have loving, caring Christian parents, but not everybody does. Hopefully, we've run into other people within the church family who have influenced us. And it's not necessarily that they were formally a mentor. And this is actually gets into a little bit of scary territory, right? Because some of the people who might have influenced you very much, you might not have actually known very well. You just observed, you just saw. Which means you got to kind of ask yourself, who's watching me that I don't know about? So, I don't mean that to be scary in a big brother sort of a sense, but in a thoughtful or thought-provoking sense.
Wow. When my parents, everybody knows they both have passed away. But one of the first times I realized that people watched me and my parents, and they watched, I had a lady from this church, and not in a bad way, but say something to me that, I said, Mom would have said that to me. Yeah. And it's kind of funny how all that sometimes relate. And so it is kind of in a way, a sticky feeling to have people come up and say something to you that I've heard that somewhere before. It was Mom or Dad, but and it was Christ as well.
And you know what can be very interesting about that? Believe it or not, kids often tune out their parents. I don't know if y'all remember that. But when you hear it from somebody else, sometimes that's what you need. I remember teaching in university, I would tell students certain things. And it seemed like in one ear, out the other. It sure didn't show up on their exams, like they actually heard anything that I said about this particular topic. But we'd invite a guest speaker in to some group and have them talk. And they could say the same thing that we said, and the kids would be like totally energized by this. And I would, they'd be talking, a couple of days later, we're in class and they're talking about it. So you realize that I've been talking about that for 6 weeks. But there was, when you're the professor and they're the student, there's a relationship there that is at least a little bit adversarial. No matter how much you want to, no matter how much you want to be approachable and so forth, there's still a power relationship there that makes things difficult sometimes, just like there is when there's a parent and child. But you get somebody else who says the same exact thing, and you might have a more open audience, an open-minded audience for that person.
That's our experience with our girls, them coming to Greenlawn, when we were coming to help take care of my grandfather and visit granddad after long. They appreciated the youth minister so much. They could all say, wow, I can't believe he said the same thing you did. They're just shocked that I actually knew something. And it's just, wow, I can't believe you knew that. It's like, shocker. But I'm sure that we're all the same way, in other ways.
Well, I was a teenager once, believe it or not.
It's hard to.
One other thing that comes to mind when you bring this up is that I've always looked at older people in the congregation and their examples. Okay. And I see it even more now that we have a lot of our older senior members, okay, that at least two things, they're still extremely faithful to reading God's word and so forth. But number two, even though it may be difficult, they're still coming to the worship assembly. Okay. Now we have example tonight. Okay. I guarantee you, okay, if Mrs. Dobbs had any ability to be able to be here, she would be here. Well, that type of commitment encourages me. Okay. And so when I look across the auditorium on Sunday morning and I see our older members that took a lot more effort than I did to get there, that's an encouragement to me.
Certainly is.
You see marriages, they're celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary or even their 60th.
We forgot to honor you guys last Wednesday night for 60. I fully intended to do that until we forgot about it.
It's too late.
Gotta wait for 70. I guess.
Sorry.
Yeah, so there's this teaching aspect that can be done by example, but then there's also the direct teaching of concepts and ideas from the Bible. And we have a word that, well, I'll ask you what you think about it. What do you think about when you hear the word doctrine?
All of my dad's books.
Yeah.
He has a whole library of Greek books. That's what
Okay. So maybe an academic, it has kind of an academic connotation to the word doctrine does. What else? Maybe at a very simplistic on a very simplistic level, positive or negative?
boring, negative.
Doctrine sounds old and stodgy and regimented, stuck in your ways, old, archaic. Are you getting my drift? Right? Isn't that the way the world? I mean, if you went out and tried to talk to people and said, let me tell you about some Christian doctrine, that might be the only words you get out while they're still in earshot.
Yeah.
Right? Because the idea of doctrine sounds rules. And I find this incredibly ironic. Knowing the rules is actually free.
Absolutely.
When you don't know the rules, everything's a mess. It's not fun. Ask any kid who has no structure in their home. What do they want? They're dying for structure. They're dying. What are the rules? Somebody show me, tell me what the rules are. And when they can't get somebody to tell them that, you have problems.
And the order they get with no rules, the harder it is to convince them of the rules.
It's very anxiety producing. Notice especially for one of our daughters who's really struggling with anxiety. She has to know what's happening tomorrow. It's not, I'm not feeling good. I'm not feeling like there's any structure happening tomorrow. It's just whatever I feel like, and she's got to know what are we eating, what are we doing, where are we going? Am I going to expect to be performing for that?
What time? Who's going to be there?
I don't know, but so I have one that really craves structure and really resists if you change things without a lot of notice.
Rules are freeing. Rules help us understand and navigate the world that we live in.
So we don't know how to win. If you don't know the rules, how do you win?
So thinking back about what the church has to offer the world, we have the care and support that you get from other people who show you care and support because we serve a God who cares and supports and loves us. The other thing we do is we teach you the rules. This is how to live. Because of what God has done for us, this is how we live.
How to win in life.
And tell me more about what you mean before I say no.
To be successful in life. What is true success in life?
Okay. If the context of life is the life that never ends,
Yes.
that becomes the eternal life,
soul.
then yes. Okay, but winning Monopoly in a life sense, no, not necessarily. Probably not. But doctrine's a good thing. It's what we teach. Teaching concepts changes our ideas, our thoughts, our perspective on the world. And when we, it goes both ways, but what we think typically turns into what we do. Now, it works the other way. You can act yourself into a different state of mind. I do it every morning, right? I don't want to get up, but I'm going to, and I'm going to go to work. Okay, now I'm here. Okay, I can do this, and it changes my attitude, so to speak. But I have a good friend, one of those people who's an important person in my life. I know he didn't come up with this, but he talked about it a lot. He said, we move in the direction of our most dominant thoughts. Whatever you're thinking about eventually bears itself out in what you do, how you behave, how you act. So it matters what we believe. And so we want to be one of the things that we do in Christian fellowship, besides just support each other, is we teach and admonish one another the rules of the game, if you want to call it that.
But the doctrine in the wrong is a set of rules that are binding, I mean, not binding in a bad way.
Yeah, and that's what it has come to mean. That words meanings change over time, and they end up being co-opted by a certain.
You get nothing more. Either gotta get up or you get to get up. Just the one letter.
That's true. I got to. All right, so
Try that tomorrow.
these are some of the things that we do. The purpose of the church for believers and for seekers: support and teaching. What about for the world? What's the purpose of the church in the world?
Seek the lost.
Seek the lost.
Be a standard.
Be a standard.
Set the example of what God wants the world to do.
Okay. I mean, we wear a name, Christian. We're kind of responsible for what the rest of the world thinks about Christians because that's what we claim to be. Whatever Christians are doing, that is who Christians are to the rest of the world. Regardless of what you believe, regardless of what you say, what you do is what defines the term. One of the things that comes through in the book, they talk about how the church's role in the world is to show the world who it is. People created by God who need a redeemer. Okay? That's at the heart of what we're to be about. But putting it in those terms, I don't know, it's just it's kind of thought-provoking and interesting to me to think about it as showing the world who it is. Their contention in the book, and it's something that they talk about at length, is one of the advantages Christians have is that we know who we are. We know who God is. We know what his son has done for us. We define ourselves in terms of what, that whole thing that God did. We have an identity. They suggest the world doesn't actually have one, but they long for one. And so they run after this, they run after that, they run after the other, seeking to find meaning in life, seeking to try to understand who they are, but they don't know. And so if you state the problem in those terms, then the church's job is to help them understand who they are. You're not a person who's out after pleasure seeking at all costs. You're not a person who is so driven by, you might be, but you don't need to be. You're not going to find your happiness in pleasure. You're not going to find your happiness in money. You're not going to find your happiness in this, that, or the other thing. Let me tell you who you are. You've been created by a God who loves you, and you need his redemption.
We have no hope. It's, this latest killing, this young man graduated from high school last year. And he said he didn't have any friends, he didn't have any hope, he didn't have any. And that's sad.
And the exact scripture reference escapes me right now, but I think about the scripture where it talks about, but what were you before? You were without hope in this world. And now you do have hope. Here's another quote from the book. It's a longer one. From a Christian point of view, the world needs the church, not to help the world run more smoothly or to make the world a better and safer place for Christians to live. In other words, we're not trying to make everything nice. You know, we're not trying to convert people so they'll be nice and we can all enjoy life here. Versus secondary paraphrasing. Since the first part already, oh, sorry, this actually is a quote, never mind. Rather, the world needs the church because without the church, the world does not know who it is. The only way for the world to know that it is being redeemed is for the church to point to the Redeemer by being a redeemed people. The way for the world to know that it needs redeeming, that it is broken and falling, is for the church to enable the world to strike hard against something which is an alternative to what the world offers. The church needs to be weird. So that when people encounter that weirdness, it's jarring. It's attention grabbing. I want what they have. This is different. Here are people who might not be rich, wealthy, or powerful. They might not seem like they're indulging in a lot of pleasurable activities and so forth, but they have joy. They have hope. When they encounter difficulties in life, it doesn't throw their world all upside down. One of the greatest examples in my life, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but it just came to my mind when I said those words. I think about our friends, Rory and Cindy McCready, losing their first child. He was 1.5 years old. And seeing them persevere through that. And I know it wasn't easy by any stretch. I know there were challenges along the way, but seeing them endure that and make it through that, and seeing how everybody else around them at that point in time embraced them and did whatever they could to try to take care of them. It's different. I've been to other funerals it was sad, but I've been to funerals that were a whole lot sadder because the person who died had no one. I love this phrase that they used in here, to strike hard against something that's an alternative to what the world offers. It's going to be jarring. It's going to be so different they can't possibly miss it. That's what we're to be, to show the world who it is. That's what's necessary. Which brings up the question, how well are we pursuing or achieving these purposes? Church membership is falling. Why?
Churches are closing.
Churches are closing. We have some folks who have come to church here from another town outside of Lubbock because church is dying out in their town.
There's no church in Tahoe anymore.
Really. So some of these smaller communities, why is that? Or why do you think that might possibly be? There are a lot of potential
In most of the
reasons.
cases that I'm familiar with is that the church got old. Okay. And I'm not saying, boring, I'm saying it got old. Okay. And the young people didn't stay around. They exited out. And so now you've got, an average age of 20 people sitting in an auditorium in a small congregation. Okay. And the average age is, 75. Okay. Well, there's not going to be much growth there. There's not going to be much, excitement for a young person or a young family to come in and want to worship there. Well, if you don't have all ages in a congregation, it's dying. Okay. Because you got to have the young ones, you got to have the middle, and you got to have the elders.
So we can kind of make some guesses about, especially why churches in smaller towns might be experiencing this, because people are not pursuing, they're not living lives that are centered around a small town anymore. So they move off to a larger city. We've seen this in Bulgaria. The church has been much larger in Sofia,
It's around 200.
and now it's 20
Still.
because they all died. And 2 or 3 generations of communism, the kids are gone.
They're in other countries.
Now, a lot of them left Bulgaria because it was so terrible. If they could scrape enough money and figure out how to get out, they did. But beyond things like that, where there's this really extreme regime that changed the way a lot of people perceived life and how you live. And if you leave aside the smaller communities where you see an exit from the community in general, not just the church, but even if you come into a place, a bigger city like Lubbock, church membership is down. Why?
I think one reason in the bigger cities is this. I think people have gotten, and I studied this in a book on it, even in college, was people want to be entertained. And if they're not entertained, they don't show up. They think, hey, it's boring at church. What's on TV tonight? What's on TV today? The game is on. They want entertainment. So they'll sometimes miss church because they're not getting entertained at church, which is I'm not saying that that's what we should do. I'm
Sure.
just saying that's their mentality. It's not entertaining. I'd rather stay home and watch what was on TV.
And so this is where some of those worldly philosophies that we talked about several weeks ago kind of kick in. The way they've invaded culture has changed the way people think about what we do here.
It's also, part of it, it's not, was a good answer, but people are listening to us, but the church doesn't have the answers. And so when they do come, I don't know if we've been trained. I feel like we've lived growing up in church. I still have trouble confronting, training, working at the Blessing Center. How do you make that initial contact?
Elaine has a story. She was just telling me before church tonight about a man that they knew in Michigan. Her parents would go meet when they were missionaries in Europe for a lot of the time, but Cheryl had some medical issues. They came home, they'd lived and worked in Michigan for about 3 years in the late 70s, early 80s. And when they started working with the church there, they tried to get to meet everybody and get to know them a little bit. And they would ask them, what's your story? How did you become a Christian? And a lot of different people kept coming up with this one man's name.
Martin Keeper.
And this fellow was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, as some might say. He had some mental disabilities, but everywhere he went, he had one question for people. Do you know Jesus?
And if you dared to say no,
He said, would you like to? I'll set you up with my preacher. He can tell you. I mean, he didn't have the mental capacity to lead somebody through a study, but he could get you hooked up with somebody who could.
And he was genuine, and he really cared about you, and so you go along with it.
Sometimes I think, and this is a challenge and a poke at myself too, sometimes we make it too hard. It's not that hard. Do you know Jesus? That's a weird question. But are you confronting the world with something that they strike hard against when you say that?
We
Yeah.
think they're rejecting us when they're rejecting Jesus. And
Yeah.
that's the hard part, is to get over
Yeah.
ourselves. It's not about us, it's about Jesus.
You know, one of the ideas that they bring up in the book that's an answer to this, why is church membership and attendance falling, is we basically, and I just mean in general, and this is getting at something Barry said a minute ago, we've turned church into a civic organization that isn't really an alternative to what the world already offers. It's just another place to seek entertainment. You know, I think I've already mentioned it in this class. I have a good friend back in Mississippi. That was his thing. Whichever church had the best music group showing up that Sunday morning, that's where he was going to go. And one of the interesting things, there's another book that I read a little while back. I don't remember the exact title of it, but it was something like The Christian Atheist. And the subtitle was something along the lines of people who profess to be Christians but live like there isn't a God. And they talked about some of these things that we've done in culture, and we've let culture invade the church to the point where we've got a lot of bad thinking, but we're calling it Christian, and it's got negative effects. And I thought of that book when I read this quote from the book. Unfortunately, an accommodationist church so intent on running errands for the world is giving the world less and less in which to disbelieve. Atheism slips into the church where God really does not matter as we go about building bigger and better congregations, church administration, confirming people's self-esteem, worship. We make it about, do you feel good through this experience, not are you worshiping God? Enabling people to adjust to their anxieties brought on by the materialism, pastoral care, and making Christ a worthy subject for poetic reflection, that we call preaching. At every turn, the church must ask itself, does it really make any difference in our life together, what we do, that in Jesus Christ, God is reconciling the world to himself? When we make it about, we got great facilities, or we've got great leaders in worship, or we've got this really good preacher who can talk in a really powerful and moving way, or all these sorts of things, we're missing the point. We're missing the point. And they contend that this is how atheism slips into the church. And I'm still trying to kind of wrap my mind around what they exactly mean by that. But I think that it's headed towards this idea that it's about all these other things and we've left God out. We might not be able to answer this question in a positive way. Does it really make any difference in our lives together and what we do? That in Jesus Christ, God is reconciling the world to himself. Whatever else is going on, whatever we do when we come together, isn't this the reason? God is working. Are we going to be with the program and get involved in it? And as David talked about a little bit ago, participating with what God is doing? Or are we sitting back and watching? And are we mistaking some of these other things that are really just the covering on top of the real thing? I'm struggling to come up with exactly the right words, but symptom and cure, or, symptom and the actual disease, we're paying attention to the symptoms. And I don't mean that what God is doing is a disease. Like I said, I'm struggling with the right metaphor to use there, but the idea is there's this stuff, this fluff on top, and then there's the substance underneath. And when we pay too much attention to the fluff and not the substance, we end up with kids who eventually say, you know what, this is all pretend anyway. There's nothing real here.
And they leave.
They leave.
And you're right. Kids are very, very good at perceiving, is it real to you? Because so many people do live functional, like a functional atheist. They say they believe in God, and they say these different things, but it doesn't change their life. And kids are really good at pointing out, yeah, that's not real. You're not living right. Why should I? Let me mean you. Why should it mean something to me?
It's almost exactly what the kid in the book who was being mentored by the immature person ended up saying. You can do it. Why not? Why can't I? And there you have it. All right, the bell rang. We're past time. We're going to continue with more from this chapter 5. So the summary that you have there, you can kind of keep reading through it and see kind of where we're going to head for next week. But the whole idea right now is, what's the church supposed to be for the people who are a part of it, and what's it supposed to be to the world, and how well are we doing it? It comes down to this question: are we behaving in ways that suggest that we really believe that God is doing something in the world that we need to participate in? Thank you. I'll talk to y'all. See y'all next time.